Imagine a world where the marble statues of ancient Rome are not silent, cold stone, but living, breathing figures stepping out of the shadows of history. Through the lens of modern technology and deep historical research, we are attempting the impossible. A full digital reconstruction of the man whose name became synonymous with power itself. This is not just the story of a dictator or a general. This is the Julius Caesar AI, Reconstruction Explained. A journey into the life and legacy of a man who stretched the Roman Republic until it snapped, birthing an empire that would define the Western world. We peel back the layers of time to reveal the man behind the laurel wreath, exploring his brilliance, his ruthlessness, and the tragic final act that sealed his fate forever. The algorithm of history begins in the Subura, the gritty, overcrowded lower-class district of Rome. It is here, in the year 100 BC, that Gaius Julius Caesar enters the world. To understand the Reconstruction, we must first visualize the environment that forged his iron will. Rome was a city of stark contrasts, where marble temples gleamed in the sun while the streets below ran with sewage and the air was thick with the smoke of cooking fires. Growing up in this chaotic environment, young Caesar was not born into the absolute pinnacle of power. He was a member of the Iuli, an ancient aristocratic family that had lost much of its former luster. This sense of a glorious ancestry that needed to be restored drove him from a young age. As we reconstruct his early years, we see a boy of frail health, but with eyes that missed nothing. Educated by the finest tutors in rhetoric and philosophy, soaking up the stories of his ancestors who had once driven kings from Rome. The Reconstruction shows a teenager, marked by the terror of the civil wars between Marius and Sulla, a time when belonging to the wrong family meant death. When Sulla emerged victorious and began purging his enemies, Caesar was forced to go into hiding, stripped of his inheritance and his priesthood. It was in these desperate moments, wandering the forests of Sabine, that the steel of his character was tempered. He learned that in Rome, survival was not given, it was taken. As the digital timeline advances, we move to the formative years of his career, the period that defined his persona. The reconstruction of Caesar's face reveals a man who was conscious of his appearance. Ancient sources describe him as tall, with fair skin, dark eyes that shimmered with intensity, and a complexion that was often pale due to his frail health. Perhaps, most distinctively as he aged, he grew troubled by his thinning hair, famously combing his strands forward from the back of his head to hide his baldness, and wearing the laurel wreath of the triumphator, not just for ceremony, but to hide his receding hairline. It is these intimate details that bring the Reconstruction to life, humanizing a figure often treated as a god. We see him not as a statue, but as a young man navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics, where bribery and violence were commonplace tools. To pay for his games and win the favor of the common people, he went into incredible debt, spending fortunes he did not yet have. This was a calculated risk, a gamble that his political future would yield returns high enough to cover his creditors. It was during this time that he was captured by Cilician pirates, an event that vividly illustrates his supreme arrogance and confidence. When the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his ransom, he laughed in their faces and demanded they ask for 50. For 38 days, he lived among his captors, reciting poetry and jokingly telling them that when he was free, he would come back and crucify them. The pirates laughed, thinking it was the banter of a spirited nobleman. But the Reconstruction reminds us that Caesar never bluffed. Once the ransom was paid and he was released, he raised a fleet, hunted them down, and made good on his promise. It is this moment, where humor and brutality met so seamlessly, that defines the man he was becoming. The narrative now shifts to the military brilliance that would secure his legendary status. The Reconstruction moves from the dusty streets of Rome to the wild, untamed frontiers of the north. Gaul, a vast land of fierce warriors of the north. Gaul, a vast land of fierce warriors and dense forests, became the canvas upon which Caesar painted his masterpiece. For 8 years, he led his legions on a campaign of conquest that would change the map of the ancient world. The AI visualization allows us to stand on the banks of the Alesia River and watch the engineering marvel of Caesar's siege works. We see the Roman lines, miles long, encircling the Gallic stronghold, a double wall built to keep enemies in and allies out. This was not just savagery. It was a tactical genius, fueled by an intimate understanding of his men. Caesar ate the same coarse bread as his soldiers, marched in the mud beside them, and knew the name of almost every legionary under his command. This bond was the engine of his success. While he fought wars of conquest, he was also fighting a war of public opinion back home. His asterisk commentaries asterisk, the accounts he wrote of his campaigns, were sent back to Rome and read aloud in the forums. They were propaganda in its purest form, written in a simple, direct style that made the complicated maneuvers of war accessible to the common citizen. Through these words, Rome followed his every step, watching the hero conquer the barbarians. But ambition has a price. As his power grew, so did the fear of the Roman Senate. They watched a man who commanded an army that was fiercely loyal to him alone, not to the state of Rome. The turning point in this digital reconstruction is a small, unassuming stream in northern Italy called the Rubicon. It was the northern boundary of Italy, and by ancient law, no general was allowed to cross it with an army. To do so was to declare war on the Republic. The scene is frozen in time, the snow falling softly on the banks, the water cold and gray. Caesar stands on the bank, his generals waiting for his order, the weight of history pressing down on him. He knows that stepping into the water means there is no turning back. The reconstruction captures the hesitation, a calculation, and the final resolve. He turns to his men, speaking the famous words that would echo through eternity. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. As he steps into the water, the Republic begins to dissolve. The march on Rome is swift and unstoppable. Pompey the Great, his former ally and now his enemy, flees Italy, outnumbered and unprepared for Caesar's speed. The reconstruction tracks the subsequent chase across the Mediterranean, culminating in the plains of Pharsalus in Greece. Here, Caesar's smaller, battle-hardened army defeated Pompey's vast forces. It was a victory that broke the back of the opposition. When Pompey fled to Egypt, only to be murdered by advisors hoping to curry favor with the victor, Caesar wept. He did not weep out of love for his rival, but for the indignity of a great Roman meeting such an end. This moment of sorrow adds a layer of complexity to the reconstruction, showing a man who respected power even in his enemies. Following his victory, Caesar returns to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a dictator. The reconstruction of Rome during his final years is one of frenetic activity and grandiose building. He centralized power in himself, bypassing the Senate and governing by decree. But his ambition was not just for power. It was for the improvement of Rome. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, which gave the world a reliable system of measuring time that lasted for 16 centuries. He planned new forums, basilicas, and libraries. He granted citizenship to people in the provinces, expanding the definition of what it meant to be Roman. Yet, every act of reform was viewed with suspicion by the old aristocracy. They saw a king in all but name. Rome had a deep cultural hatred of the word asterisk rex asterisk, king, dating back to the expulsion of the Tarquins centuries before. Caesar seemed to be tempting fate. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate, allowed his statue to be placed among the kings, and accepted the title of dictator perpetuo dictator for life. The AI reconstruction highlights the eerie atmosphere of these months. The crowds cheered, but the whispers in the Senate grew louder. Friends began to distance themselves. Brutus and Cassius, men he had pardoned and promoted, began to circle like wolves. The visual narrative shifts to the omens and warnings that plagued Caesar in his final days. Sacrificial animals were found to have no hearts. A soothsayer warned him of the Ides of March. His wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of their home crumbling and him bleeding in her arms. The tension in the air is palpable, the city a powder keg waiting for a spark. The climax of the story brings us to the Senate House on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC. The reconstruction slows down as we approach the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day. Caesar enters, ignoring the warnings of his wife and the soothsayer. He is confident, perhaps arrogant, dismissive of the threats as mere gossip. As he takes his seat, the conspirators move in. They surround him under the guise of presenting a petition. Tullius Cimber grabs Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his shoulder, the signal for the attack. The reconstruction captures the chaos, the sudden eruption of violence in the hallowed hall. Casca strikes the first blow with a dagger, aiming for the neck. Caesar rises, reacting with the speed of a veteran fighter, catching Casca's arm and driving his stylus into it. But he is quickly overwhelmed. The daggers come from all directions. The ancient sources tell us he fought back, kicked and thrashed, trying to cover his face, but there were too many. And then he sees Brutus. Brutus, whom he had loved like a son, whose mother he had loved as a mistress, whom he had spared when he could have destroyed him. The Reconstruction focuses on Caesar's eyes in this moment. The fight leaves him. Seeing the face of a friend among the assassins breaks his spirit. He pulls his toga over his head and falls at the base of Pompey's statue. He had been stabbed 23 times. The man who had conquered the world was brought down by a few men in a crowded room, killed by the very institutions he sought to control. The fall of Caesar is not the end of the Reconstruction. It is the pivot to his legacy. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, marched out to the Capitol, shouting, "Liberty," to a city that fell into a terrified silence. They believed that by killing the tyrant, they had saved the Republic. But the Reconstruction shows us how profoundly they misunderstood the situation. They had killed the man, but they could not kill the need for strong leadership that the chaos of the late Republic had created. Enter Mark Antony, Caesar's right hand, and the young Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. The scene shifts to Caesar's funeral. The Reconstruction captures the raw emotion of the Roman mob as Antony delivers the famous funeral oration. He displays Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing to the tears in the fabric, the holes where the daggers had entered. The mob, stirred to a frenzy of grief and rage, turns on the conspirators, driving them from the city. The assassination did not restore the Republic. It doomed it. The civil wars that followed were bloody and protracted, ending only when Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra and emerged as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The final phase of the Julius Caesar Reconstruction Explained is an exploration of how a life becomes a legacy. As the digital dust settles on the ruins of the Republic, we see the skyline of Rome transform. The marble buildings Caesar planned are completed and expanded. The calendar he reformed structures the year of the empire. The very name Caesar becomes a title, adopted by emperors for centuries to come, eventually evolving into words like Kaiser and Tsar. But his legacy is a double-edged sword. He is remembered as a military genius whose strategies are still studied in academies today. He is remembered as a brilliant writer whose Latin prose became the gold standard for the language. And he is remembered as a visionary who saw the Roman state for what it was, a broken system in need of total overhaul. Yet, he is also the warning etched into history. He is the ultimate example of what happens when democratic norms are eroded by ambition, and when the concentration of power becomes too great to be checked. The Reconstruction ends not with his death, but with his endurance. 2,000 years later, we are still telling his story, still reading his words, and still fascinated by the man who dared to cross the Rubicon. In the silence of the digital Reconstruction, as the virtual crowds of Rome fade away and the marble structures dissolve into data, one image remains clear, the face of a man who believed he could conquer time itself. He lived fast, loved recklessly, and died violently, ensuring that his name would never be forgotten. As we look back through the lens of technology at the man who became a god in the eyes of his people, we are forced to confront the timeless nature of power and the fragility of human life. Julius Caesar's story is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a mirror held up to every age, reflecting the eternal struggle between the ambition of the individual and the stability of the state. In the end, the Reconstruction proves that while men may die and empires may crumble, the echo of a life, lived with absolute conviction, can ripple through the millennia, reminding us that history is not written by the victors, but remembered by those who dare to question the price of greatness.